I think we can get started. Okay, so hi everybody. Welcome to this is lesson number 4 of the Launch School Prep webinar series. So these webinars are actually standalone and don't require you to have attended any previous one to understand what's happening in this one. However, we are assuming that you're in the process of going through the Launch School Prep course, and that's where this material will be the most applicable. If you're in 101 or 110, this is actually still like a really good way to solidify your mental models and check your level of understanding as well. So I think everyone's really welcome here. My name is Grace. I'm a TA here at Launch School. But like most other TAs, I'm actually also a student in JavaScript track myself. So I've been through the prep course as well, and I've been in the same shoes as you are now, kind of getting to cover all this new material and in the process of going through mastery. So I'm hoping this can feel like a safe space for everyone to learn, but also to especially make mistakes and ask questions. Mistakes are where we definitely learn the most. So yeah, happy mistakes only. Another thing is that there are no dumb questions here. Just I ask that if you are going to ask a question, that you please direct it to Zoom's Q&A feature. That just helps me keep track of the questions that need to be answered and have already been answered, since the chat is more for idle conversation and comments, so it might kind of get lost through any conversation that comes up. So the Q&A feature, please. I'll be coding out a lot of examples today, and you're highly encouraged to code along and try out the examples yourself, and also kind of playing around with it to experiment with different results. However, if at any time you're overwhelmed or you feel like you're falling behind, I would say try not to worry about it too much and just do your best to follow along. You can just watch as well. And that's because all the material in this session today isn't anything that hasn't been covered on the Launch School Introduction to JavaScript book. So that's a publicly available book on Launch School's website, which is right over here. I'm actually going to send the link and into the chat. So all the material I'll be covering today is based exactly off of this book. There's nothing new. So if there's anything you missed, you can always reference that book. We're simply using these prep webinar series as kind of a way to make this book a little more interactive and a less solitary learning experience. Okay. Another thing is today I'll be using Amazon Web Services Cloud 9. This is coding IDE, so it's what we usually recommend for those just starting out. But you can really use any coding environment that works for you. Personally, outside of these webinars, I use VS Code. So honestly, anything works for you as long as you have access to a terminal, and it should have Node installed. If you're joining us for the first time today with Cloud 9, then you don't have to install anything. It already comes pre-installed with Node. So you should see a screen similar to mine, and you should just be ready to go. Okay. So today's lesson specifically is going to be about arrays and objects. So these are the two most common data structures that JavaScript programmers use. We're going to be looking at the similarities, but also the differences between the two, and when it's kind of more appropriate to use one over the other. Next, which is really the common core of today's lesson, is we're going to be looking at some built-in JavaScript methods to iterate over arrays. So this also means we're going to go over what callback functions are and how they work with these array methods. And then lastly, we're going to take a couple ways to look at a couple ways to iterate over objects as well, because it's a little different from how we would iterate through arrays. Okay. Let's see. So yeah, let's jump straight into it. Let's take a look at arrays first. So arrays. So what is an array? So arrays are essentially an ordered list of organized data. So the ordered part is actually really important. They can contain any data type, so contain any data type. And we create an array using square brackets. So square brackets, and we separate each value with a comma. Values divided by comma. So I'm going to demonstrate what that means. So if in the terminal, I'm going to type node, I'm going to hit enter. And we're going to see a welcome to Node. It means we're inside the Node environment, which is a JavaScript coding environment. So Node is a really great tool because unlike the typical route of creating a JavaScript file and executing the file, for Node, it simply shows us the result of the code that we enter into it right away. So let's create an array. So as I mentioned, we're going to use square bracket. I'm going to use an open square bracket, and then we're going to list out the values of our array. So as mentioned, it can contain any data type. So this is called heterogeneous. So it can contain a string. Oops, I hit enter too soon. We can contain a string, we can contain a number, we can have Boolean values, undefined, null, right? I can even actually have an array within an array as well, but we won't get into that. So as you can see, I separated the values within the list by a comma, and then I closed my array with another square bracket. So if I hit enter, we're going to see the output of that code, which is going to be the array that we just entered, right? I'm also going to create another array this time. And in the first array, we had very different, all different data types, but I can also create an array with just one data type, which is strings, right? So we're not limited in the type of values that we can put into an array. So how then do I go on about accessing a value from the array? So I use a set of square brackets, the same ones I used to construct the array. So I'm going to bring up the array back again that I just entered by hitting up on the terminal. And that brings back the last line of code that I entered. So if I want to access a value from the array, what I do is I use a set of square brackets, the same ones that I used to create the array. And from within those square brackets, I have to put the index of the element I want to access. So indexes are positive whole numbers starting at the number 0. So arrays are what we call zero indexed, in which each element will have an index, but simply it's just ascending numerical order. But the key thing to remember about arrays is that it starts from the number 0. So ace will correspond to the number 0, will have index 0, king will have index number 1, queen will have index number 2, and jack will have index number 3, right? So if I want to access the third string, queen, I would actually need to put the number 2 because the index starts at 0. So it'd be 0, 1, 2. So if I put the number 2 in between those square brackets that I appended to the end of the array and I hit enter, we access the third element in the array at index number 2, the string queen. Okay. So that's arrays. And next, objects. So objects are similar to arrays in which they're a list of organized data. However, unlike arrays, they're not numerically ordered. So also a list of organized data, but not numerically ordered. Right? So as we saw in the array, because the indices, or that's plural for index, the indices are numerically ascending and they start from 0. So the order in which we enter elements into an array is especially important because it'll determine how we access them, right? However, that's not the same case for objects. So I'll demonstrate in just a moment. So an objects are also a list of organized data, but not numerically ordered. They instead use a dictionary-like system in which we have a word and definition, right? But it's actually, what it's actually referred to as is the key and its value, okay? Or key value pair is what we usually refer to it as. Okay, so let me demonstrate what that looks like. Oh, and also we create them with the curly braces instead of the square brackets. And the key value pairs are delimited by a comma. So for the array, we just had the values and they were delimited by a comma, they were separated by a comma. But for the object, we're going to have pairs that are separated by a comma. So let me create an object and show what I mean. So let's zoom in there a little bit. Here I have I'm going to create an object using the curly braces. And I'm going to create an object that has an animal followed by what sound they supposedly make. So we're going to define a key, and I'm going to then append a colon at the end of the key. Remember, it's kind of like a word definition type of structure. And then I'm going to say dog barks, and I'm going to make that into a string, cat meows, and pig blinks, right? So I'm going to hit enter and show. So we have the key here is dog. The value of that key dog is barks. And then, so that's one key and value pair. So we're going to separate that, and then we're going to have another key value pair. The cat is key, meows is the value. And another key value pair, pig and oinks, right? Kind of like word definition. The most important thing about the key here is that it's actually always a string. So even if we haven't used any quotation marks here, it's actually still a string. So no matter what value we make into a key, actually, it's always going to be coerced into a string. It's going to be changed into a string. So we have to keep that in mind, especially because when we're accessing values of an object, we're going to have to use the key. Okay, so how then do we access elements in objects? We actually use the same syntax as we did with arrays, where we append square brackets to the end of the object that we want to access, and then we put the key of the value we want to access. So if I want to access the value meows, right? If I want the value meows, then I'm going to have to put it within these square brackets, the key cat. However, as I just mentioned, keys are always strings, so we're going to have to write cat within quotation marks here. And hit enter, and voila, we get meows. If I were to do the same thing without the quotation marks, JavaScript, for this specific type of notation, for the square bracket notation and like accessing objects, JavaScript is going to interpret cat as a variable or some sort of keyword because we didn't put in quotation marks. So if I hit enter, it's going to say uncaught reference or cat is not defined. So for our square bracket notation, remember to always use the quotation marks. Okay, so that's a quick review on arrays. Again, here we have that array that I created earlier. Again, it's indexed from 0. It's 0 index. So our indices are 0, 1, 2, 3. So if we want to access the third element in our array, we're going to have to put index number 2 at the end. For objects, we have the individual values, but they're corresponding to a specific key. And then those key value pairs are separated into commas. So the key is always going to be a string, no matter what value we put there. The keys for objects are always strings. And then we have its values, which can, in this example, I've made them all strings, but again, we can make them into any type. The values here are just as flexible as the values that we put into arrays. And then we refer to each key value pair separated by a comma. Okay. Cool. Any questions so far? So I have one question. Can you name the indexes so you don't have to type it all? Do you mind elaborating on what you mean by this question a little bit? Naming the indices so you don't have to type it all? I believe you might just have to write it in the chat. I don't think I can give any type of permissions here. Are you referring to assigning a variable or initializing a variable to the value of the array? So if your concern is about typing it all over again, so if I go back into Node, I can actually declare kind of like in Python. Yes. So that's actually a really good point. What we can do is actually declare a variable. So I'm going to name my variable R, and then I can initialize it to be the value of the array. So let's just have an array with 3 numbers. And then instead of having to type out that entire array and then like accessing the index from there, instead we can simply just access the variable, the value that's stored in the variable, and we can go R and index 0 to get the first element, right? So what we're doing is we're declaring a variable and saving the array within that variable. So whenever we access that variable, we're simply accessing that array. So I guess I'm not familiar with Python, but I'm sure that's probably the same way that it works here as well. Okay, great question. That makes sense. Cool. I would like to learn Python once I finish the core curriculum. I'm already like, oh my God, JavaScript. Okay, cool. So moving on. What's the big deal with arrays and objects then, right? Well, specifically, if there's a list of data, we should be able to, iterate through the data and manipulate the data in a meaningful way for the purposes of our program. And a way we can do that is by using iteration methods. So if you're asking, what is a method? Let's make some notes here. What is a method? Right? So a method is simply just a function, actually. Method is a function. Right? If you've already played with JavaScript, you've probably encountered functions before. And functions are really predetermined snippets of code that we can execute whenever we need them, right? You'll know that if you have messed around with functions before, you'll know that you first have to define it before you're able to later invoke it in your program. But we usually refer to the functions that JavaScript comes with as methods. For example, a common one that you've probably already used by now is console.log, right? Console.log. Oops, I'm not in my node. That's my terminal. So if I use console.log, right? This is a built-in JavaScript method that we didn't have to define or declare anywhere. It already existed in JavaScript for us to be able to use it. So if I do console.log and I put in the value hello in between the brackets, we're trying to output the string hello to our console, to our terminal, right? So similar to console.log, which is a built-in JavaScript method, we also have other built-in JavaScript methods that are specifically for arrays and objects, okay? So let's take a look at some array iteration methods first, all right? So moving forward, I'm gonna exit the node REPL, the node REPL, and instead I'm going to create a JavaScript file now to execute. So the way I'm going to do that is in our terminal, I'm going to type the command touch, which means to create a file, and I'm going to create a JavaScript file names.js. If I hit enter on the left side, we're going to see that a file appeared, right? And I'm just going to open it up. And so this is where we're going to be entering our JavaScript code, and then we're going to run the file after we finish running our code. So I'm going to declare a variable, and I'm going to use that using the let keyword, and I'm going to give it an initial value of an array, right? However, instead of an empty array, let's populate it with some values. So I'm going to do an array of our TA names here, all strings. So we know that from accessing arrays earlier that if I want to access each element in the array, I'm going to have to list them all out individually like so. So let's say I want to output each one, even if we have saved the array to a variable, we can see that this is still actually quite tedious. Like I'm going to have to write down each individual line, right? Copy pasting, usually not a good sign if you're coding. And error prone because I'm doing it manually. So if I run this file now, first I'm going to save the changes. On my Mac, it's Command S. I have to save the changes to the file, and then if I go back into the node terminal, the terminal, and I type node and the name of my file and I hit enter, we run the code, and so we get the results. We've logged each individual element of the array to the console, right? This is where our first array iteration method is going to come in, which is the for each method. So for each. Oh, oops. I'll circle back on that in a second. So for each, right? So the for each method is an array iteration method, and it expects a callback function as an argument. So a callback function is simply a function that we pass into another function or a method. Excuse me. So the first argument that for each expects that we put in between the brackets of for each is going to be a function. Therefore, it's going to be a callback function. What for each does is that it iterates through the array that it was called from, and it invokes the callback for each element. So it's going to call the function that we pass into it as it's going to invoke the function that we pass into it per element of the array that we call it from. The important thing about for each is that it will call the callback function for every element in the array, but it's not going to do anything with that value. For each is not creating a new array, or it doesn't use the truthiness or the falsiness of the callback of the return value of the callback function in order to generate a new array or anything like that. In fact, its return value is undefined. Okay. A lot of confusing jargon here. Let's demonstrate what I mean. So I want to log the value of I want to log each value in the array similar to what I did before with the manual console.log. However, this time I'm going to use for each. So the way that we use for each is that we take the array that we want to call it from. So this time it's names. And then I'm going to call for each by writing dot for each. That capital E is definitely important there. It's case sensitive, so don't forget it. And then I'm going to close it a set of parentheses at the end of for each. So this is how we call for each. Technically, I've already called for each. However, remember that for each expects a function as an argument, the callback function. Okay, so we're going to pass in a function. And there's actually several ways we can define a function. There's actually 3 ways. But for this example right now, I'm going to use a function expression. So we use the function keyword, followed by, we can provide a name for the function if we want, but it's optional here. So I'm going to do it without a name. So then we're going to put a set of parentheses and a set of curly braces. Okay, I'm going to save that. So this is us passing in a function into for each, right? So now that we've created our callback function, I'm going to open up the function body here, and I'm going to write console.log. Okay. But what data do I provide console.log, right? We're missing something here. And that's because we actually need to define a parameter for the callback function. And remember that a parameter is a variable that will be initialized to a value, right? So in this case for each, if I define a parameter name, the parameter, whatever, we can name the parameter whatever we want it to be. It's still going to be initialized to the same value. So what for each is going to do here is that for every time for each invokes the callback function, it's going to initialize the parameter name to the current value that it's iterating on. So remember, so if for each is going to iterate through every single value in our array, name will then be initialized to the current value of the array. All right. So if it's going to be initialized to the current value of the array, that means in order to log each value of the array, I simply need to put name here. Okay. So I'm going to save the changes to my file again. And then again, back in our terminal, I'm going to run names.js, hit enter, and we should get the same results. Okay. So one more time, I called the for each method on the array saved into names. For each expects a callback function, which is simply a function that is going to be executed at every element in the array. For the callback function, it has one parameter. We can name it anything we want, but the parameter is going to be initialized to the current value that the for each method is currently iterating on. So when we're first on the first element of the array, which is the string Grace, name is going to be initialized to Grace. So that means in order to log Grace, we need to do console.log name because the value of name is currently Grace. But then when the for each function moves on to the next element and calls the callback function for this next element, that means name is now going to be initialized to Pete, right? And it basically takes turns for every element initializing that parameter to that element. Okay, cool. I'm simply breaking it down again one more time visually for those who need it. So here's our array, and here's us calling the for each method on that array. We've passed in a function expression with one parameter, name, defined. And then within the function body, we're logging the value of whatever name is initialized to. So here, name has been initialized to the string Grace, and that means when we log the value of name, it's going to be Grace. And then the same for all the other elements as well. Name is then initialized to Pete, Luke, and then Karis. And then it logs those values respectively. So this is why for each is also considered an array iteration method. Okay. Any questions on that so far? I think for each might be a lot of the features of for each that I mentioned might be kind of confusing, like the fact that it returns undefined, or that it doesn't do anything with the callback function other than invoke it. But we're going to see why those features are important, especially because we're going to contrast it with the map method, which is commonly confused with the for each method in terms of what they do. So I have a comment here. Somebody asks, oh, you can just declare types in JavaScript, right? So I'm not familiar with other programming languages, so I'm not sure entirely how it works, but actually, well, I've done a little bit of Java, and I've noticed in Java, you don't declare variables simply with let or const. You actually have to specify what type it's going to be. So you say things like float or int or string, or I believe. So in JavaScript, we actually don't declare any types. We just create variables, and then we can assign it to literally any value. And also a lot of type coercion, or like silent type coercion, which is when JavaScript secretly changes the type of a value without letting you know. That's also a very JavaScript thing from what I've heard. And it's actually a really painful thing in JavaScript. So that's something to be aware about. We don't actually explicitly declare types in JavaScript, and that can lead to a lot of bugs. I believe that's why TypeScript was created, but I'm not entirely sure on that, so don't quote me. But if that's something that does confuse you, I would suggest definitely tuning into, we also go through data types and variables for these workshops. Oh, you meant the function portion of names.forEach. Oh, so actually, good point. So here it's not to declare a type. It's simply, that's just simply the syntax of how we declare a function in JavaScript. We have another way in which it doesn't use the function keyword, but try and think of the function keyword as like a keyword to declare a function. Rather, it's kind of like we use let to, which is a keyword to declare a variable. It's not a type indicator. So function here is not a type indicator, but that's a really good question. Oh. Yeah, like seeing the differences between other programming languages is so wild. No, not at all. Like you don't have to apologize about it. I think or like you don't have to be like I should have read up on it because it's really easy to get confused. It's like, oh, like there's so many similarities between languages, but also there's like just enough differences and nuance where you're kind of like, oh, that kind of got me. So that's cool. I'm definitely interested in picking up Python. My top two languages that I'm thinking of picking up after launch school are maybe Python and Rust, because I hear a lot about them. Okay. Let's go through the map method now. So map is similar to for each in the sense that it also expects a callback function. This is another array iteration method, by the way. So maps is similar to for each. It takes a callback function as an argument. However, the difference between map and for each is that map is actually going to construct and return a new array with the same number of elements as the array it was called on, right? So the reason why it has the same number of elements as the array it was called on is because it's going to use the return value of each callback invocation as the values for the new array. Okay, so let me demonstrate what that means. For this example, I'm actually going to create a new file, and I'm going to name it initials.js. And I'm actually going to copy this array that I created, the names array, and then I'm going to move it over into the initials file. Okay, so I've basically declared the variable names in this new file, and I've initialized it to a new array, right? So again, I'm going to call the map method by on that array by writing .map, right? So I've called the map method, and again, map takes a callback function, right? So I'm going to need to supply a function. And as I described before, we can define functions in 3 different ways in JavaScript. So before I used the function expression that used the function keyword, but another way that we can also define a function is to use an arrow function. So this is going to deviate really differently from what we know usual function syntax, but really it's a set of parentheses, and then we're going to make an arrow with an equal sign and the greater than sign, and then I'm going to have a set of curly braces, right? So this is our arrow function. It's very unique. So again, this is where we put our parameters in between the parentheses, and then in between the curly braces is where we have our function body. So this is also a function. This is not exactly the same. We used a different type of syntax before, but this is another way to define a function. This is perfectly valid. So I'm going to open up the function body, and again, as before, what array iterations methods commonly do, and this is what works for map and for each, is that it's going to iterate through each element in the array, and then we're going to have to define a parameter, right? And it's going to be name, and remember that name is going to be initialized to each element of the array. So if we need to refer to the value in function body, we're going to refer to the variable name, right? So let's see. As stated before, for the map method is actually going to use the return value of the callback function. So that's our function that we passed into map. Map is going to first invoke the function on each element of the array. So if we're at the string grace, it's going to invoke this callback function, and then it's going to use the return value of the callback function in order to generate a new array, right? So let's say I want to create a new array that only has the first initials of the names in the original array, right? So if I know that the callback function will be invoked at each name, what would I need to return from the callback function in order to just get the initials? I would have to get the first character, right, of the value name. So the great thing about strings is that they're also indexed. They're 0 indexed, just like arrays. So I can actually access the first element alone just from using the square bracket syntax and then putting the index of the first character, which is 0, right? I just want the first character of each name, right? So this should create the new array that I want. So let's see what happens when I run that code. Something that I'm actually going to do is I'm going to have to save the value of names.map into a new variable. Let initials equal to names.map. And that's because, as I mentioned before, map actually creates a new array and then it's going to return that new array that it creates. So we're going to have to save that somewhere in order to see what it does. And then I'm going to have to log the value of initials to see what our returned array is. Okay, so I'm going to save that file. Then I'm going to go back into our terminal, node initials.js, and run the file. And we can see we got an array of 4 undefineds. Interesting. So why is that? Why did map return an array of 4 undefineds? And that's because our callback function doesn't explicitly return the value name index 0, right? Remember that for functions, unless you explicitly use the return keyword to return a value, the implicit default return value for a function is going to be undefined. So what happened here is that map went through each individual element of the array, and a name was initialized to the value of the array, the value that it's currently iterating on of the array. And then it invoked the function, but then every time the function was invoked, the return value was undefined because we didn't explicitly tell the function to return a value. So that's why we get 4 undefines. If I just adjust the callback function to put the return keyword, now we are explicitly returning a value for the callback function. And so when I save the changes again and run the file now, we should get the initials, GPLK. Okay. An important thing to note about map is that if I log the value of the original array, and I press Command S, I'm going to save it, and I run the file now, we can see, so initials is a new array that has only the initials, GPLK. But when I log the value of the names array, we can see that it still is the same array. It wasn't affected, right? It wasn't mutated by the map method. And that's because, again, map is calling this callback function and constructing a new array, but it's not actually doing any modifications or any mutations towards the original array. Okay, I won't actually go too much into mutating arrays right now, because that's actually what we're going to cover more in next week's sections. We're going to be diving deeper into array and object mutability and the concept of pass by reference. So if that's something you struggle with, definitely tune in next week as well. Okay. Let me just break down what happened real quick with map again. So we had an array, right? We had an array of our 4 names. We called the map method. Sorry, I actually didn't use this. This is no matter how we define the function, it does the exact same thing. In the written example, I used an arrow function, but in this slide is going to be a function expression, right? So we passed in a callback function, and we have the callback function explicitly return the first index of the name. So when map iterates through each value of the array, name is then initialized to the current value, Grace, and that means the expression name index 0 is going to evaluate G. And since we explicitly return that value, G is going to be the new element of the array, right? And then when we run Pete, again, that expression is going to evaluate to P. We explicitly return that, and that means the new value of the new array is going to be P. And then same thing and so on and so forth for LK, for Luke and Karis, right? And that's why we get this new array, GPLK. Whereas in contrast with for each, if we go back to the for each example, right, we have the callback function, and for each is going to call the callback function, which is just simply console.log. However, it doesn't do anything with the return value of the function. It doesn't create a new array. It simply just calls the callback function and does nothing else with the value. Okay, so that's something really important to remember. For each does not create a new array. Map does create a new array. Map does use the return value of the callback function that we pass into it. For each does not. Okay. Okay. So, any questions so far on that? Let's see. Where should it be name versus names? Good question. So, in line 1, really these names are, this is confusing because I'm talking about names and they're called names. So these are variable names, and they can be anything I want it to be. It can be something like TAs or teachers, or in this case, I've just decided to use names. And then from within the callback function, I have to define a parameter. And this can also be, this is a variable that's going to be set to whatever value that we're currently on. So if the map method goes through each individual element of the array, and then it's going to activate this callback function. So whenever it activates the callback function, it's actually going to pass in the current element as an argument to the function. So it's going to pass in the string grace to be the argument of this function. And so that means this variable, we decided to call it name, is going to be initialized to grace. And then after it finishes running the callback function for this value, then it's going to move on to Pete, and then it's going to initialize name to Pete. But again, that's because this is a variable. It's going to store this value into it. Exactly. So name is for the human and future reference. So name is so that we keep it dynamic, if that makes sense. Because if I simply write, if I hard code it, let's say we don't have any parameters, right? Then I have no way to reference the value in the array. I can hard code it like this. I can do return grace.0, but that means even though it's going to do that for every single element, it's always going to remain grace 0. So if I run that now, we can see that for every return value for the callback function, it's going to be GGGGG because I hard coded it. So in order to keep it dynamic, in order to get the values of every value in the array, I'm going to have to give it a name. So I can make this any name that I want. I can make it E, I can make it potato. I can literally like name it any variable that I wanted to, but in order to keep it descriptive, I do name, and I do name index 0, right? Good question. I hope that helps. That is confusing. I think the hardest part about array iteration methods is the callback function and understanding what's happening in the callback function. Okay. So to check everyone's understanding, I have a short quiz of just 2 questions here. Cool. So what is the output to the console? Yes, for these methods, there's 2 separate things happening. So one is that the method itself that we're calling, so for each or map, for example, that's being called, and then that method is what actually iterates through the array. And then the function that we pass into these methods is what's being called on each element of the array. So it's like 2 systems happening at the same time. I think it can be very confusing. So can you move the question so the slide is visible? You can, I can't actually, you'll have to move your window yourself. I can't move it for you. You can drag the question window over to the right. Is the array integers or strings? I thought it defaulted to strings. So it's actually it was object keys that default to strings. For arrays, we can have any values in it that we want. We can have any data type within an array. And it doesn't have to be all the same data type. It can be we can mix strings and numbers and all data types into one array. Okay, I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. Okay, let's take up this answer. So I'm going to just create a new file for this. Move it up here. Okay, so what's our code? Let's just copy and paste it. So let's see what's happening. I have an array of 4 numbers, 5, 10, 15, 20, and I'm calling the for each method. So dot for each, and then within for each, we're passing in a callback function. So in the callback function, we have one parameter. And again, remember, this parameter is going to be initialized to every value in the array. And then within the function body, we're logging the value of number minus 3. For each number in the array, we're going to log the value of number minus 3. So then the question is specifically asking, what is output to the console? So let's see what is output to the console then. Quiz.js, and I hit enter, and we get the numbers 2, 7, 12, and 17. Okay, so right, for each is going to, remember, go through every element of the array. And then it's going to activate this callback function for every element of the array. Number is going to be initialized first 5, then 10, then 15, and then 20. So that means we're going to log the value of first number is going to be 5. So 5 minus 3 is 2. Then 10, which is going to be 7, then 15, 12, and 17, right? And it logs this to the console. And that's simply what the question is asking. What is the output to the console? It's true that if I were to, for example, let's say I save this to a value, this array, and then I called for each from that array. And then let's check what the, let's check what the new value, or let's simply check what the value of what for each returned is. So if I log the value of new R, we're going to see that we get, first we get 2, 7, 12, 17, because that's the for each method. And then we're logging the value of new R, which is undefined, right? Because remember, for each returns undefined. It's not that the callback function in this case does return undefined because we haven't set an explicit return value. But remember, the question is asking you what is output to the console. It's not asking you for the return value of R, or pardon me, the return value of for each here. So the correct answer is 2, 7, 12, and 17. Okay. Next question. In this question, what is the value of new R? So remember, ask yourself first, what method are we using? And then you have to ask yourself, for that method, what's important about this method? Does it use the return value of the callback function? Does it create a new array? I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. Okay, cool. Let's take this up together. So I'm going to show you how I would approach a question like this, right? I just have to get rid of these illegal quotation marks that Google Slides keeps replacing my quotation marks with. Oh, excuse me. Okay. So this is how I would approach this question. So first, I'm going to break it down. I've declared a variable named R, and I'm going to initialize it to an array. And in this array, we have specifically 3 strings. We have blue, red, and green. Okay. So first, in the line after that, I've declared a new variable called new_r, and I'm going to initialize it to the return value of map called on array, right? Whatever this expression returns is what I'm saving here, okay? Oops. So that means I have to ask myself, what is the return value of map? If I think back to my description of the array iteration methods earlier, we have for each and we have map. So then I'm asking myself, okay, for each does not have a return value. Its return value is undefined. But what about map? All right, map creates a new array. So let's write out that new array here just to visualize it. Okay, so then I know that map takes a callback function. So let's look at the callback function now. So 1, map creates a new array. So let's construct a new array. Number 2, map is going to invoke the callback function on each element of the array. So we know that color is going to be initialized to blue, and then color is going to be red, and then color is going to be green. And then does map use the return value of the callback function? It does, right? Map does care about the return value of the callback function. So we can see in the callback function then, yes, it does have an explicit return value. So it's not going to be undefined, undefined, undefined. We know that now. The explicit return value of the callback function for each invocation is color.length. So .length is another built-in JavaScript property or method that gives us the number of letters in a string or the number of characters in a string. So blue has 4 characters, red has 3, and green has 5. So when color is initialized to blue, it's going to explicitly return color.length, which is 4. And then when we're at red, color is going to be initialized to red. So color.length evaluates 3 and then 5, right? And map is going to return this new array, and then we're going to save it to the value of new_r. So if we log the value of new_r right now and save the file, we should get 435. Okay, that's the correct answer there. Cool. Any questions so far? How are we feeling? Let it sink in for sure. Callback functions are very tricky. I really struggled with it when I was going through the prep course. You simply have to remember there are 2 processes that are happening. One is the method that we're calling, whether it be .map, .forEach. Another one is .filter. And remember that this is the method that's going to iterate through every value of the array. And then process number 2 is a callback function. So every time we're on a new element, so if we're on the first element, this callback function will be invoked, and then the parameter will be initialized to that element. And then if it has a return value, and whether or not the method that we're calling cares about that return value. Remember that for each, for example, does not care about the return value. We can have an explicit return value here. We can have an implicit value if it was for each, and for each will not care what it is. It will just invoke the function and be like, okay, like I don't care about the return value. Map does care about the return value because it's going to create a new array and then use the return value for that callback function in order to construct that new array. Okay. Okay, we're almost at time. I just want to really quickly go through how to array through objects. It's relatively simple and it's pretty straightforward. So we can speed through that pretty quickly. I'm going to create a new file, pets.js. Let's open that up. Drag that up here. Okay, so for object iteration, we don't actually have any specific built-in methods that can iterate through the keys of an object, but we can have some alternatives to approach that. So I'm going to declare a variable named pets, and I'm going to initialize it to an object. I'm going to make that same object that we did at the very beginning, where it's these animals and the noises that they make. Make link. right? So again, so far, if I want to log each value of the object, again, I have to do pets, and then I have to do the square syntax, and I'm going to do dog. And then, right, I'd have to do cats, then I'd have to do bird, then pig, right? Like this is how I would have to tediously go one by one through each key value pair to get the values that I want, right? So if I run that file, pets.js, we get the value, just the value strings. We don't get the keys because I'm logging the value that corresponds to a specific key, right? So again, remember that this is really tedious and error prone, and we don't want to be doing that. So we don't have any built-in methods that we can call on an object to simply iterate through it. Excuse me, but we can actually use a built-in method called object.keys. Object.keys. And then we put the parentheses, and we put the object of that we want the keys of within the parentheses here. So pets. Right. So I'm just going to log the value of this expression here just to show you what it creates. So let's get rid of these for now. I'm going to save this. And if I run the file now, we can see that it actually gives us the keys of the object that we passed into it neatly in the form of an array, right? So we've just demonstrated a couple array iteration methods. So if we got each key of the object in the form of an array, that means we can now use the array iteration methods on the returned array in order to iterate through every key, and then therefore we can iterate through every value of the object, right? So let's see what I mean by that. So we know that this returns an array, and that means I can call dot for each on that array, right? This is the same thing as me doing let the keys equal to object.keys pets, and then I can simply invoke for each on keys, right? Same thing is happening here. So let's continue in this way. So if I want to log each value again of the object, I'm going to do dot for each, right? And remember, for each is actually suitable here because I'm not trying to create a new array. And all I want to do is I want to log the value of each value in the object to the console. So I'm going to use the for each method. So for each, remember, we're going to have to pass in a callback function. So function, I'm going to do a function expression, which means the function keyword, parentheses, and curly braces. I'm going to hit enter to open up. Remember that for each is going to invoke this callback function for each element in the array, which is currently going to be these 4 keys. So I'm going to set the parameter to be key. That's most descriptive to me. So for each key, we're going to simply log the value of, it can't be just key because key is going to be dog, cat, bird, pig. I want the values of the object. So that means I'm going to have to do pets square bracket key, right? So remember in this case that we're actually using a variable here, so we don't have to put quotation marks. If we put quotation marks, then actually what we're going to look for is the key, like for example, like key. But we don't have that here. So remember, we have to take off the quotation marks because we're trying to access the variable. Because key for each iteration is first going to be dog, then cat, then bird, and then pig. Right? So I'm going to save the changes to the file there, and I'm going to write node pets.js. And there we are. We should get each individual value: bark, meow, chirp, and oink. Okay. If I want both the keys and the values, I'm just going to have to adjust the callback function a little bit here. So I can do something like I want key plus a colon plus pets and key. Right? Let's see what that looks like. I'm going to put a space here as well. And if I run the file again, we're going to see dog, bark, cat meow, bird chirp, oink, pig oink, right? Because here I've logged the key, which is going to be dog, cat, bird, and then I concatenate it with a colon and a space, and then I concatenated that string with the value. So that's why you get one long string that has both the key and the values. Okay, so that's one way we can iterate through an object. There's also another really simple way to do it as well. If you're familiar with a for loop, we have also a simple for in loop. So I'm going to create my looping structure first. So I use the for keyword and then add the parentheses and the curly braces. So I'm going to open the curly braces up. This is our loop body. But first on the parentheses, I'm going to write let key in pets. So I've declared the variable key, and it's simply going to be initialized to every key within the object after in, right? So right now I wrote in and pets, so that means the object that we're iterating through is the pets object. And again, this variable that I declared, it's going to be initialized to every key of this object, but I can name this variable anything I want it to be. I can write let animal, let pet. I can even be confusing and write let value, but remember that it's in code, we want to be descriptive. So key would be a good way to describe what's happening here because we're iterating through each key. If we want to stay semantic to the content that we're going through, then I can say something like animal, or I can do pet, right? So let's just do animal for now. And then same thing as before. Since animal is going to be initialized to each key in the object, I can do pets animal. And then I'm going to wrap that into console.log expression so we can see what's happening. And then save the changes. And if I run it, again, we get each individual one. And then same thing as before, I can do some string concatenation to get the key and the value pair. Okay, so that's basically it. That's the two ways to iterate through an object. There is actually a key difference between these two ways to iterate through an object. However, it's not something you need to know in 101 and 101 and 110. That comes more into object-oriented programming in 120. But just know that for now, these are two ways that you can iterate through an object. Okay. So I do believe I've gone over time a little bit, which is usually the case with these. So I do have a little bit more. If you do want to stick around, I'm going to just go through one more quiz just to test everyone's understanding of what we've covered so far. However, if you do have to run, I do respect your time and no hard feelings. So, like you're totally allowed to leave. The only thing is I ask that everyone just fills out this feedback form. It really helps us know what's working with these workshops and what's not. So yeah, please, if you have a minute, it's pretty quick to fill out. I think it's just like 3 or 4 questions. This is a JavaScript workshop. So please just give us a little bit of feedback. If you're dipping out now, then thanks a lot for attending. Next week, I'll be going a little deeper into arrays and objects, and we're going to be covering mutability. So this is pass by reference and pass by value. This is a really important concept. And I also think one of the more tricky ones. So I think these webinars are really helpful, especially for these topics, because it's really good to visualize it. So if you're joining me next week, it's going to be at the same time. And I believe you should be able to register through the same portal on Launch School. You should see the webinar registration link there. Okay. So if you're heading out, thanks a lot. If you're sticking around, as I mentioned before, I still have a couple quiz questions, and then I'm going to be sticking for a couple more minutes for any other questions that anyone else might have. Okay. Thanks a lot. Okay, so for those of you sticking around, here's our quiz. What is the value of new R? Remember, ask yourself, what method are we using? Does it care about the return value of the callback function? Is it going to create a new array? Is it going to return a new array? I'm gonna give it a couple more seconds. I think the majority of people have gotten this wrong. This is a tricky one. I'm intentionally, oh, actually, so totally disclaimer, these quizzes are intended to trick you a little bit. So sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. Yeah, these quizzes are really checking for a thorough understanding of the code. So if you're not getting the answers, I would say like don't feel discouraged by it. Like these are really like exploring the edge cases and the full understanding of these methods. Okay, let's take this answer out. So let's go back to the quiz one. Right, so let's log the value of new R. And so node quiz.js. And the answer is it's going to be false, true, true, true. Okay. So let's break down what happened. So initially in the first line, we've declared the variable R and we've initialized it to this array of 4 numbers, 3, 5, 8, 10. We then declare a new variable, new R, and we're going to initialize it to the return value of the map method being called on the array, right? So first question to ask yourself, for map, since we're saving it, the question is explicitly asking what is the value of new R? So that means we have to pay attention to what is going to be returned by r.map, right? So then we ask ourselves, okay, so does map have a return value? And remember, yes, map returns a new array, right? So that means let's start visualizing this new array. So the callback function we pass into map is a function expression, and it has one parameter, num. And then within the function body, it explicitly returns the comparison between num and 5. So it uses the greater than or equal operator to compare num and 5, right? So another question we have to ask ourselves before we do any thinking about the expression is, does map care about the return value of the callback function? And the answer is yes, it does. So remember that map uses the return value of the function as the new value for the array, right? So let's figure out what the return value is for each invocation. So for 3, num is going to be initialized to 3, and that means we're going to evaluate num is greater or equal to than 5. So is 3 greater or equal to than 5? And the question is false, right? 3 is not greater or equal to 5. So that means false is the first value that's put here, right? Next time, num is going to be initialized to 5. So that means return num greater or equal to 5 is return num is greater or equal to 5. Or if 5 is greater or equal to 5. And 5 is equal to 5. So we're going to write true, right? Remember this greater than or equal operation, it returns a Boolean value. And map specifically, no matter what this return value is, even if there's no return value, is going to use that return value in order to construct a new array. So then again, so num is 8, num is greater or equal to 5, 8 is greater or equal to 5, it's true. Great, 8 is greater than 5. And then lastly, when num is 10, is num greater or equal to 5, num is 10 is greater than 5, so we get true. So the correct answer is false, true, true, true. Okay. At first glance, this looks like it could be like looks like the callback function looks like it should be used for filter, and I think that's why a lot of people answered 5, 8, 10. But remember, we're using for map specifically, it does use the return value of the expression in order to create the new array. Okay. For filter, it checks for the truthiness of the return value and then determines whether or not this element should be in the new array. But for map, it's just going to use the return value of the callback function and then use that value itself. Okay. So a really good thing to notice about map is that it uses, when it constructs a new array, the new array has the same amount of elements as the original array, because for each element of the original array, it's going to use the return value. So it makes sense that it then has the same number of elements as the original array. Okay, so that's kind of a way to double check your understanding. If you have a new array that's constructed by map, it's always going to have the same number of elements as the original array. Okay, tricky. Next question. What is the value of new R here? A lot of mixed answers for this one. Okay, let's take it up. Okay, so as usual, let's check the answer first. So let's log. So the question is asking, what is the value of new R? So let's log it to the console, and we're going to see that new R is undefined. That's just one undefined. It's not an array of undefined, it's just one undefined. Okay, let's break down. Why is that so? So first line, we declare a variable R and we initialize it to an array of 5 numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right. Since the question is asking what's the value of new R, so we declare a new variable new R, and it's going to be initialized to the return value of r.forEach. Okay, so first question we ask ourselves, what method is being called on the array? So the answer here is for each, and that means for each. What does for each do? It does not create a new array, right? It simply is going to call the does not return an array, right? In fact, for each returns undefined, right? So there's our answer for us right there. It returns undefined. So we actually we kind of just have our answer there, but let's keep breaking it down further. So the callback function that we pass into for each has one parameter num, which is going to be initialized to every element of the array, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Within the function body, the callback function is explicitly returning the value num plus 1, which means here it's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. However, with for each, because it's not creating a new array, for each does not care about the return value of the callback function. Sorry, I'm going to fix that. So many windows. Right? For each does not care about the return value of a callback function because it doesn't create a new array. It's like we gave it a callback function and it has an explicit return value, but then for each, for every iteration was like, okay, so what? What do you want me to do with that return value? Because for each doesn't do anything with the return value. It doesn't create a new array. It won't use the return value for the new array. So that means at the end of the day, for each does activate this function for every element of the array, but then it just like was like, okay, yeah, I invoked it. Like, what else do you want me to do? Because it's not going to do anything else. So it simply just returns undefined. Okay. Some of you may have confused. I saw a couple people answer the array with 5 undefineds in it, right? And that's not the correct answer because that would, I think there was maybe some confusion about the return value of for each. So there's 2 return values to look out for these array iteration methods. One is the return value of the method itself. So dot for each has a return value of undefined. Whenever we use dot for each, it's for each that has a return value undefined. The callback function itself, this one has an explicit return value. It's not undefined. It's going to be different for each element because it's returning the evaluation of this expression. But this is not the return value that's undefined. It's the for each method that is undefined. Okay, so you have to be on the lookout for 2 different return values here. And that's kind of what I meant earlier, but you have to be on the lookout for the 2 different processes that are occurring. Okay. Okay, 2 more questions. So what is the value of new R here? So again, remember to break it down like I've been doing it so far. If we're looking for the value of new R, then we have to ask ourselves, what method are we calling? Is it going to create a new array? Does it care about the return value of the callback function? If so, what is the return value of the callback function? I'm gonna give it 10 more seconds. Okay, let's take this one up as well. Ugh, these quotes will be the end of me. Okay. Let's see what the answer is. So remember the question is asking, what is the value of new R? So let's log the value of new R and we're going to get undefined, undefined, undefined. So it's an array of 3 undefines. Okay, that's the correct answer. Okay, let's break it down because a lot of people didn't get that answer. I fooled you all again. Okay, so first line, we declare a variable R and we initialize it to an array with 3 strings, Grace, Claire, Trevor. We're going to declare another variable, new R, and we're going to initialize it to the return value of r.map. Okay, like before, let's ask ourselves, okay, r.map, or we need to know the value of new R. So then we ask ourselves, what method are we using? It's going to be map, which returns a new array. So it has a return value. Okay, so right off the bat, we know that new R is going to be a new array. So let's construct that new array right now. Right? Again, map is going to invoke this callback function for each element in the array. Okay, so name is first going to be Grace, then Claire, then Trevor. Within the function body, we simply have the expression console.log name, which means what? It means that the function does not have an explicit return value because we don't use the return keyword, right? So that means no matter whatever expression is here, I can make it something crazy like name plus name plus name. Like that's going to be like 3 names appended together. But because we don't have an, like, even if I save the changes here and I, oops, I didn't log it. So that log new R. So even if I change this, even if I make that change into the function body here, no matter what I put into this function body, it's just constantly going to be this array of undefined. And that's because the callback function, unless I use the explicit return keyword, is going to return undefined. Remember that with any function body, any function really, if I don't use the explicit return keyword, it's always going to return undefined. That's the default return value of a function unless we use the return keyword. There is one exception to that case, but I won't go through that just yet. So the original code was console.log name, right? So every time the function ran, it did output the string to the console. As we see up here, it showed Grace, Claire, Trevor. However, there's a difference between output and the return value. So even if it's output, there was no explicit return value, which means that it was undefined. So for when we run the string Grace, it logged Grace to the console, but then because the function didn't return a value, we simply got undefined. And then the exact same thing happened with the other two. And that's why we get an array of undefined. Okay. Tricky. But I think people are understanding now because almost everyone answered either the first answer or the third answer, which means everyone seems to understand that map returns a new array. So that's a good plus. Okay, great. Last question. What is the value of new R now? Give it a couple more seconds. Okay, let's take up our last quiz question. Okay, as we can see, it's pretty much the exact same code as the last question, except we have added the return keyword. So that means the value of new R is obviously going to be still undefined, undefined, undefined. Okay, why is that? Why did that happen? I'm about to frustrate a lot of people right now. So, like I mentioned before, the code is exactly the same. All we did was add the return keyword. So why then is the return value of the callback function still undefined? And that's because if we go into our node terminal, I'm going to write node in our terminal and hit enter. If we go into our node REPL, the REPL, this is a good tool to remember, again, to see the return value of our code immediately. So if I write something like 1 + 1, we immediately get the return value, right? So if I write console.log, and I'm going to write the string Grace here, and if I hit enter, you're going to see 2 values. So the first is what we output to the terminal, which is the string Grace, and then we also get this line undefined. And that's because console.log returns undefined. So even if something outputs code to the terminal, that's not the same thing as a return value. Return value is what's going to be used again for map. It's not whatever is output to the terminal. And in general, in JavaScript, there's a distinction between output to the terminal and return value. So console.log, if I were to ask the question, what is log to the console, or what is the output of console.log grace, we're going to say the output of console.log is grace. But if I ask what is the return value of console.log grace, or console.log anything for that matter, it's going to be undefined. So even though we explicitly return the value of console.log and whatever the value of name is, no matter what the value is passed into console.log, the return value of console.log itself is always going to be undefined. And that's why still for this code, even if we have an explicit return value, it's still going to be an array of 3 undefined. Okay. Tricky code. Okay, so that brings us to the end. Thanks so much for staying overtime and going through those frustrating quizzes with me. I hope you learned something today, and I hope this was a big help in callback functions, return values, and array iteration methods. So thank you so much for attending the workshop. As I mentioned before, next week we're going to cover, we're going to dive deeper into array and objects, and we're going to go through some iteration methods and talk about mutability, which means when an array or an object is mutated. So if that's something you struggle with, remember also we're going to be covering paths by reference, which I would say is maybe one of the more difficult concepts that students really struggle with. I'm going to be visualizing that with a lot of diagrams as well. So yeah, same time next week. If you would like to cover that with me, please join. Happy to have you. For today, it would be a huge help if you do fill out that feedback form just to let us know what's working with these workshops and what isn't. So thanks so much again, everyone, for attending. I'll see you next week if I see you. Otherwise, good luck with your studying. I'm always available in the Slack if you have any other further questions. And lastly, yeah, if you have any questions right now, actually, I'll be sticking around for maybe an additional 5 to 10 minutes just to cover anything, any of the material that I talked about today, or anything about launch goal or JavaScript, or yeah. Thanks a lot. Okay, so I'm gonna hop off here, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day or night, wherever you are. Okay, bye.